So next in our distribution bundle, let's look at purchase order processing. We'll cover topics such as replenishment, requisitions, the purchase orders themselves, receiving, invoicing, and so forth. And always, as a reminder, there's a VAR training PO guide as an accompaniment. Now we need to start with replenishment. Replenishment is all about math. So we're here at the slides for the bulk of the replenishment discussion. Replenishment provides a way to query the system for suggestions on items that need to be purchased. An in-depth understanding of replenishment is beyond the scope of this class, but we will put together some thoughts about it, including some of the calculations that go on behind the scenes. And much of this can be found in the PO Appendix A replenishment help doc. So the information is out there for you to look at later, but I wanted you to have slides and live discussion as well. Replenishment interfaces with three modules. These three, in fact: AP, purchase orders, of course, and inventory. Data is configured in AP and inventory, and the replenishment tasks themselves are launched from purchase orders. So in AP, you have to turn on replenishment in the AP parameters, set up the buyer codes. Actually, you could do that in inventory if you wanted. We already talked about that in our configuration processing, if you'll remember, way back in session 1. And we need to assign buyer codes to each vendor. On the IV side of it, we need to look at the stocking tab, which is crucial for the replenishment calculations. And then vendor detail itself, there's quantity discounts, and they may play into cost calculations. And purchase orders has the replenishment tasks. As I said, they're launched from purchase orders, the purchase order side of things. Let's take a deeper look here, starting with AP. Now again, the buyer codes, we did talk a bit about them, but just to bring it back fresh in your memory and in this context, as you recall, buyer codes are about grouping our products, defining categories. It's not about a human buyer, but about a group of products. The review cycles say, how closely do I need to monitor this item? And as I noted there, the smaller the number, the more frequent the review. And I've just shown on the slide here some of the buyer codes that are set up in the demo data, and they're there as examples as well as for you to play with as you exercise the demo data. So those buyer codes would be found on the maintenance menus, but this next one is actually found in the vendor master additional options. So the first task on a maintenance menu is always the master file. In accounts payable's case, of course, vendors. So on the additional options tab of the vendor master, we have our vendor replenishment detail. Here we can have multiple buyer code setups and specify review cycle days and specify a next review date, as well as our target information. Now, the target is a set of minimums to qualify for a vendor's best pricing. Completely plays into various ways of thinking about replenishment. On the IV configuration side, inventory, in the item master additional options, warehouse master, on the stocking tab, we have this information. We've only briefly looked at it before. We've talked about our order point code and EO code and so forth, but we haven't talked about the way our maximum quantity, order point, EOQ, safety stock, the way those fields actually play into our replenishment processing. And that's what we're going to dig into here. So I believe I might have said early on when we talked about the configuration process, I think I might have already said that the only two of these quantities, EOQ, maximum quantity, order point, the only two of those that aren't used to calculate the suggested order quantity are safety stock and lead time. They're printed on the replenishment register, as we'll see, but the system, Addon, doesn't actually use it in the calculation because the user is expected to have already incorporated them into the calculation of order point. So ABC is used to weight the usage estimates. The buyer code, as we already talked about, used to find the review cycle days. The vendor, similar situation there. Our lead time is the default here. The vendor's lead time actually overrides this. Okay, the maximum is the suggested. It's important because the suggested order quantity calculation aims for the maximum. We'll look at the specific calculation in a little bit. We have a slide coming up that goes through what these mean in more detail and how the system uses them. So more inventory configuration. This one we already talked about in configuration as well, and we looked at the quantity discounts. For replenishment, we need to be thinking about the lead time, and that this lead time here supersedes that on the inventory warehouse stocking tab. Okay, so when you run replenishment, it aims at getting you a suggested order quantity for each of the items that may need to be ordered. That said, what does that mean? Right here on the slide, it's talking about the equations and how you can think about it. Because when you look at the report, as we'll see, it is a lot of numbers that needs to be analyzed by the buyer. And in this case, I mean the buyer as in the human being buyer, the actual human who's doing the analysis. So maximum quantity minus the on hand minus the on order rounded to the nearest EOQ. And then if that is 0, then the suggested will be the EOQ. If both the maximum quantity and the EOQ are 0, suggested is line point, and so forth. You can read down the slide, and I suggest that if this is your area, that you refer back to this. And again, this is also in the appendix that I spoke of. The takeaway point on this, though, is that there are various, if this doesn't work, let's use that. So if we end up with 0 and there should be something suggested, it'll keep going on down through the logic. So more order point more replenishment calculations are order point, the average use during lead time, which is calculated, plus the safety stock, which comes from item maintenance. Line point is the order point plus the average use during review cycle time. And that the average use during review cycle time is calculated. The current quantity is the item maintenance. So your warehouse tab, right? Quantity available plus your quantity on order. And that quantity on order will include your open purchase orders and your open work orders. And the maximum quantity is user defined, and what you would like it to be as the user defining it. Various industries might calculate it in different ways, but it's the maximum desired quantity on hand. And that's taken into consideration as well, as we saw in the previous slide. Okay, so that's the configuration, the setup for replenishment. Once you have all that set up, then the system's ready for offering suggestions for purchasing. And the first step in that, so now we're over on the purchase order side, the first step in that is to select what items and vendors, buyer codes, what you're looking for it to provide the information on. So your buyer codes, again, they suggest alike items, and there's a range for that. And you can also filter the report by vendors, a range for that. And your beginning review dates, you remember back on our various setup forms, that review date, the next review date, was part of the forms, and here you can select a range for that, as well as your range of warehouse items, and you can include an optional 50-character comment to be included on the register to kind of identify it for what you were looking for when you ran this. Okay, now I think that we've seen the slides and it's time to see it in action. So let's hop over to Add-on for a little bit. Now, anytime you start looking at running a demo or some such, you need to be aware of the state of your data. I've restored the data at this point to the standard demo data with the additions of, I've put in a vendor, VTV 100. I've put in a customer, also VTC 100. This is, as we have seen in our earlier sessions of AR and AP, and inventory as well. I've put in an item, VT100. I did that by copying, just as we did before, I did it by copying item 100 and making a few modifications for our purposes. Okay, so think back to the slides just a minute ago. We talked about, we have purchase orders, inventory, and AP all playing into our replenishment. So what parameters do we have going on for inventory? Always orient yourself to the state of things. So we're running serialized, not LIFO, FIFO, we're using average costing, multiple warehouses. Okay, just a general, what's my expectation for how my items are going to behave? Accounts payable. Remember, replenishment requires that the replenishment processing option be checked. It is. Okay, so we're good there. Buyer codes. These are the same buyer codes that we've been looking at all along. As I showed in the slide, we have these buyer codes in play. We can also look at them, of course, by just scrolling through. Okay, so just looking at buyer code A, but let's wait a second. I'll throw this right up here. Third thing in accounts payable, vendor master, vendor replenishment detail. So vendor master, vendor replenishment detail. So we have to set this up. And as you recall, a vendor may have multiple buyer codes. So let's see what we have entered here. So we have a buyer code B set up for a purchase address 01 with review cycle days of 15. We're not using targets, and our next review is 4/20. That's when it's scheduled to be up for review, eligible for review. Okay, let's look here at our buyer codes. We could, of course, also use the hyperlink, but I have it up already, so we'll just look here. Buyer code B is set up for review cycle days of 40. we've overwritten that default. For this very special vendor, they can get it to us in 15 days. Okay, so, and that's the buyer that we have set up, just one. Very good. So that's the AP side. Inventory side. For our item master, we have two places we need to visit. Our warehouse master stocking tab. So again, we're looking at our VT 100, pulling up the warehouse, in this case warehouse 01. We've set it up for an ABC analysis of A, buyer code of C, and you'll remember buyer code may have different cycle days than what we're including with our vendor, but in this case on the stocking tab there's not the additional place to put in a different review cycle days. We have our lead time, maximum quantity of 55. This is all I ever want to have on my shelves. When I get to 20, I need to order more. I know that because it's going to take some time to get it here, and during that time I expect to use at the most 20. But that would be on the outside because I expect to have safety stock of 10, and when I do buy something, it's most economical for me to purchase it in a quantity of 4. So that's a very quick rundown of those fields as they're set up right now for our VT 100 for Warehouse 01. So vendor detail. Here we have a vendor on our stocking tab, but there's vendor detail at the item level itself. So for item VT 100, just a quick look here, and we can see that we have 3 vendors. 2 of them are primary. We'll look at that again in a minute. We did talk about it a little bit, but we need to hit it again. And we have various breaks and costs and so forth with different lead times. Lead time being the thing that we're really concerned about here. So 2 different primaries. What's that about? So this 800 has a lead time of 10 with these quantity breaks. Let's look at our secondary. Takes them 30 days to get it to us. Costs a whole lot more from them, so we could see why they would be secondary. And our third vendor is set as primary. Again, the primary designation is for the human. Addon won't take that and do anything with it. The human could look at the primary vendor and know that somebody else has already judged this vendor to be a better option when options are being sought. So a lead time of 4, pretty good breaks in alignment with our costs here, so primary also. But that lead time of 4 days is key here for our purposes. Okay, so that is our inventory and our vendors. Third piece, purchase orders. So that was all in preparation so that we can do our replenishment. Once it's set up, then you're golden. So replenishment. As I said, the first thing we do, I'll move this down here because we'll be referring to these here. The first thing you need to do is to set up some selection options. So for our purposes, we again have a limited data set, so we could run it for everything as long as our ending review date is after the date that is in the vendor replenishment detail, vendor master replenishment detail For the buyer code, it's by buyer code after the next review date there. Okay? So our item is stocked by this vendor. The next review date is 4/20. So let's just go ahead and put that date into our options entry form and run it. Oh, I should put in the comment there too. Guess that's the end of that. Okay, now what that did was it went out. I should have pointed it out, but right down here we could have seen it processing. In fact, it was filling up a green bar, progress meter, and it made selections for a register. So the register includes these two options that you can select or deselect as you wish. In this case, we've selected the bottom here. It says print suggested items only. In other words, if an item would not have any quantities suggested, then it would not show up on the report. Print warehouse detail, that is to say, rather than rolling up any suggested quantities. And this would make sense to have checked because our items are in fact, they're stocked at the warehouse level. So most often that would probably be checked. Now let's run this. You can see it's taking action down here. And here we are. Let's make this a little bit bigger. And we ran it for quite a lot of data because we did not narrow it down to particular buyer codes, because I wanted you to see an increased amount of data. So we have 16 pages in this report by buyer code. And let us cruise on over. That was a total for buyer A. Here's buyer code B. And then by vendor within buyer code. And buyer code C. By vendor. And here we are, buyer code C, VTV 100. Our stocking vendor. Okay, this is the comment that I typed in. So that's at the top of the page there. And then let's just look at some of the information here. So this is for Warehouse 01, and it gives us the actual and estimated annual usage. And when I said actual and then I said estimated, it's because I know that these two stars mean that the usage is estimated. You notice we have no data available because it's a brand new item. So there's no usage information for the system to use in a calculation as far as that goes. Now we have another code here. M is saying that our suggested buy is based on maximum. E is saying that our suggested buy is rounded to the nearest EOQ. Okay, so let's look at this. This first lead time safety stock. Okay, so 4, we know where that came from. That was the 4 that we had for the vendor. And our safety stock is on our item. We don't have any available or on order. Again, brand new item. Our order point, these are those fields we filled out. And let's look right away at our maximum quantity and versus our suggested order quantity. Now our maximum quantity is 55, our suggested order is 56. One might wonder why. That's because, as it says here, that it's rounded to the nearest EOQ. It is most economical for us to buy in 4s. So rather than saying, let's order 55 of them, let's go ahead and get the best possible economic order we can. It's rounded up to 56. It does give weight as well, so it's a good idea to keep that information up to date on your items. And with this, a human being can make the decisions about whether this is how our item should be restocked. So always on the last page, a rundown of those codes, so it's right there with it, and of course the codes are also in the help. So that's a rundown on replenishment. As far as the running of the report, we looked at the setting it up as far as our information we need on our vendors, and in inventory we ran a selection and then we ran the register, and now it's offering us the opportunity to update our cycle dates for our selected buyers and vendors. So in other words, that date that says when will this person next be considered for review will be updated based on our current register here. Let's go ahead and do that. And now I'll just close this. It's looking very cluttered. There we go. So now it's asking us if we want to create the purchase requisitions. So with replenishment, we can automatically generate some requisitions. So let's go ahead and do that. And now let us pop into requisition entry. I don't want to go too far into requisition entry yet. What I'd like to do though is I should probably just do a query here rather than scrolling through. There it is. I'd like to show you that here we have a requisition. I'm going to make that a little bit bigger for us. Generated by the system for our 56. So it's here for editing, and we can queue it for printing, and from our register we can populate it out into a purchase order itself. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. I'd like to wrap up the replenishment section and then we'll come back to requisitions. So for now, we'll close this and we'll pop back over to the slide. Okay, let's just take a second to do a quick example of replenishment to just kind of talk you through the nuts and bolts of what's going on there. We've talked a little bit about the calculations that are happening in the setup, and we saw it a little bit, but let's just get pretty specific. So if we had item 1001 and that item had a maximum quantity of 100, and it had an on-hand quantity of 21 and an on-order quantity of 20, that gives us a raw suggestion of 59. So that suggested order quantity equals the maximum quantity minus the on-hand minus the on-order for a raw suggestion of 59. Doing that math there, 100 minus 21 minus 20. But our EOQ is 19, so 59, our raw suggestion, divided by 19 gives us 3. We round that up to 4, and we multiply that back by the 19, our EOQ, which gives us 76. So that's how it's thinking behind the scenes when it's making our suggested order quantities. Okay, those of you who are not big replenishment people, take a big sigh of relief. We're done with that part now. Now we'll just go into add-on and take a look at purchase order entry and receiving and invoicing and so forth. Okay, when we talk about our purchase order entry programs, we're talking about requisitions, purchase order entry itself, and purchase order receipt entry. Now there's also purchase order invoice entry, That one, the form is markedly different, but with these three, requisitions, purchase orders, and purchase order receipts, the forms are very similar. You'll only find one or two differences among them. The differences are important, but they're minimal. So once you understand one form, you'll understand the others. Let's just quickly do a comparison. Starting with the header section, you can see that we have the same fields. This will be the same if we were to look at purchase order receipt entry. I'll drag this to the side here, and let's just look at the fact that we have very similar fields. Let me readjust that. Didn't have it lined up very well. Very similar fields here, with the addition of a potential receipt date over on our purchase order entry form. The other fields are the same all the way across, and the same with the dropship tab. Now, when I said that the other fields were the same, I neglected to point out that a very important difference. Purchase requisition entry has this flag here, and we are going to talk about that in a minute because it's quite important. So I'll just bring up a record there, and then let's just briefly look at the fact that the fields in our detail, I'll just drag this. Oops, I'm sorry. Let me grab it correctly. There we go. Okay. Line code. Now I have these compressed, so this may not be the way that you want to run or that another individual might want to run. It depends on a person's preference, of course, but I have them compressed so that we can see more at once. Okay, so all these are the same. Aha! Here we have a difference. So our requisition quantity on our requisition entry and quantity ordered on the purchase order entry itself. And we also have a quantity received field on purchase order entry because quantities may be received partial shipments, multiple shipments for a purchase order. So we have that field there. Other than that, they're the same. And we will find that to be true when we look at receipt entry as well. So rest assured that though there are a few forms to go through here, that it's not really that much to take in. Okay, that being said, let's just close up purchase order entry for now, and we will focus on our requisition. You recall we generated requisitions, and that's what we have here in our file from our replenishment, right? So once we have generated our requisitions in our purchase requisition entry, we can decide if we want to change them, delete them, add additional ones. This one, let's just delete it. And we'll say yes, delete the records, and there we go. There's our record for VT100 for our VAR training vendor. Let's edit that one by adding some message codes to it. I'm going to Control F there, and you can see the message codes that we have. The STD code, standard message, that comes stock with the demo data. I've entered in a few others, and I've used clever ways to describe the descriptions so that we can understand how I have them flagged. Both, remember, they can print on requisitions, on purchase orders, or neither, or both. So I put in a header and a detail for both, a header and a detail for purchase orders only, a header and a detail for requisitions only. So we're looking at requisitions, we're in the header, let's grab that requisition header message, and down here in our detail, let's drag that over a little bit, we have the ability to put a message in here. And let's use our requisition detail message. So that's all that I want to edit on this for now. I could make additional changes to our requisition quantity, our cost, or so forth, date required, but we won't do that for now. I pressed escape and F7, and let's look at the next requisition. We're going through the process a person would go through when they've generated requisitions either from work orders or from replenishment, and then they're reviewing and making minor edits, deleting any requisitions that they don't want to work with or have updated into the purchase order system. Now this one, let's say I don't actually want to create a purchase order for it, but I do want to keep it as a requisition for now so that I can do something with it at a future date. I just click the hold and save it. And let's go ahead and do the same for that one. Now we have on-demand printing, so we can print our requisition here, or we can batch print them out here. Just to save time for everybody, let's go ahead and do the batch print out here. As is often the case, we have a restart available to us, and our sequence, we can print it in requisition sequence, vendor sequence, alpha, or warehouse sequence. We'll just leave it as the default vendor. And here we have our purchase requisition. There's the overall look of it, but let's make it bigger so that you can see it in more detail. Let's pop over to the, or rather scroll through to the VT100. Now here, you recall I put in message codes. So this requisition only message was keyed into using detail lines. Okay, so that's where it would print. If we had multiple detail lines that use the message code, this message would print with each of those lines. And down here we have this message is requisition only. It's in the header. So it's in the body separate from the lines by a bit where our header messages print. And as I said, these will print only on the requisition. And then there's that message that I typed in at the beginning. We have a purchase agent's signature down here, and then it asks if we want to update the requisition print file. We will. That just clears the print file. Let's look at our register. I'll go ahead and just run it for all, but you can see that we have a number of options again, beginning and ending, requisition number, vendor, our report order that we can put it in, date type, order date, required date, don't deliver before date, and that type that you select would be applicable for the date range. And we can optionally print a page break. So let's look at the register now. And the first thing you'll see is that we have only 2 of our requisitions printed here. That is to say that the requisitions that we've marked to be held are still back in our requisition entry file here, and not available for the register. Remember, the register is telling you what will be updated, so it will only print the items, in this case, the requisitions, that will be available for update. So, of interest here, on the source column, we can see that this, actually it's specific to lines, in fact, that these two lines were manually entered. So the source is from actually typing it into the purchase requisition entry task. Whereas this one, which we know to be true, the VTV 100 VAR training vendor, that's the one that we updated from replenishment register. So now these are available for our purchase order entry. Whoops, I meant to save that. Let's do that. And let's go ahead and update this requisition register. Now, having done that, let's just quickly pop back into our requisition entry, and I'll just navigate through the records. So there's the one on hold, there's the other on hold, and that's all our records. So those two that we had on hold are still there, as we would expect, and that's what that means. That's how that behaves. And I'll show you in a minute that the other two are over here in purchase order entry now. Let's just take a quick tangent here to point out our purchase order parameters. You recall our defaults. If you think back to our configuration, we have a default for holding our manual release, and now you know what that's for. So if it's a usual practice for an installation, for the business rules of a particular client to want to hold for manual release, all you have to do is check that, and the majority of the generated requisitions would come in for holding, and you now know what that means. It won't be available on the purchase requisition register for automatic update into purchase order entry. Oh, while we're here, I might as well show you that the ship via purchase order, freight terms, free on board, all of these were defaulted based on this, and we could have also defaulted our requisition message code, which would have gone right here, or our purchase order message code, which is for the purchase order itself. One last thing while we're here, you recall I mentioned that our defaults are in 3 sections. This one for the requisition generation, and so the line code, the non-stock line code, the message type line code, that information you can see now because the requisitions were just generated. That information was needed for any of the potential line types that could have been generated. So there we go. Alrighty, we'll just close out our requisition entry, and let's just pop into purchase order entry. And I'll stretch that up just a little bit. We'll do a query here on our records. And these 2 purchase orders were the ones we just generated. They came from our requisition register update. And the purchase order numbers can be set, as you'll see in the administration section, can be set specific to an installation. So let's just go ahead and pull up our good old friend VTV 100 and look at what we have now. As we already discussed, the fields are largely the same. I will note here that our quantity ordered, that used to be the requisition quantity, and so that was put into the quantity ordered when the purchase order was created. We should also note that our standard message code came over, and you'll recall that I specified a standard message code that was specific to the requisition. So we're going to see what happens when I go ahead and print this purchase order, what that means. But it does come over from our requisition. Let me just slide this over down here, and you can see that that's the same case with our standard message code at the line item level. It will come over from our requisition. Okay, so let's go ahead and put in a purchase address here. And save it. I could add additional lines at this point if I wanted to, but let's just go ahead and print this for now. Okay, so let's just look at our purchase order now. At this global level, you can see that it looks like the requisition. Now I'll make it larger so that we can look at the specifics here. We used to have a line item message right here, and we used to have below that a purchase order, well actually requisition level message also listed. Neither of them are there, and that's because of the type of message code that I chose. And so now you see the difference between selecting a requisition only, a purchase order only, or a both type message code, both at the line item level and the header level. You can play with that and have the messages print out where you want them. Of course, I could have changed the message for my purchase order print, so you can see how those can swap around. In addition, we can also see that we now have a ship from information, which is based on the purchasing address that I put in there. So as I mentioned, this was the on-demand print, and you also notice that it looks just like the batch print. Sure enough, they're the same. Now, having printed this on demand, I would need to queue it for printing if I wanted it to print in the batch as well. In our case, we'll call that good enough. And having been printed, we can do a purchase order receipt entry. So we would press enter, and to get the next receiver number, so the system will automatically provide that. And our purchase order number, we can always do a Control F here if we didn't remember that it was purchase order 7. I will grab the same one we've been working with, and it asks if you want to create a receipt from it in case you had grabbed the wrong one. In our case, yes, we do. And so it asks, is this received complete? And do you want to default the order quantity? If you receive it complete, then regardless of the quantities you put in, it will say that you're done. And not complete will create back orders. Default to quantity ordered. This is here for speed of entry. You would check that based on whether the majority of the items that will be listed are likely to be the full order quantity. When that's the case, it just makes it easy so you have fewer to edit. If it's likely that it's mostly partial, then you would uncheck it. I'll go ahead and leave it like that, not receive complete, and we will go ahead and default to the quantity ordered. Since we're running lotted serialized, it does check that for us and reminds us that we need to enter in the lot numbers. In this case, I believe we're running serialized, so serial numbers. So you can see that our quantity ordered is also now our quantity received. We can edit that if we wish. In fact, let's go ahead and do that. So we'll just set it to 2 for now. And we'll enter in a serial number. Let's type that a little bit better. And you'll remember the difference between serial numbers and lot numbers. Serial numbers are specific to one item, quantity of 1, whereas lots actually can have multiple numbers of items, a greater than one quantity. So I'll save that and close that. And now you can see we have a quantity received of 2. I didn't note it, but you can't change the quantity ordered once you're in receiver entry. But that's an important distinction to think about. And also up here we do have a packing list number available at this point, optional for the entry. And now let's look at our register. We can optionally print each receipt on a new page if we wish. In our case, we won't. And let's just take a look here. And you can see that we have both the one we just worked with and a stock one that came with the demo data already in our system. Both of them have back orders because they were not received complete. You recall we had that option to specify that we wanted it received complete. And we have our lot serial information listed, our quantity ordered and received, costing information, and so forth. And as a register, of course, we'll get our GL recap, but with purchase order receipt registers, there's additional information that comes along with. So we have stock inventory receipts all grouped together by warehouse and receipt date. So this is our stock inventory, right? And for each line item that's listed, it notes whether it was received complete or not. And then we have our general ledger recap, which we're all familiar with by now. Looks a little different with the information that's specific to our PO purchase journal, but the overall look, other than the memos, is the same, very consistent. Let's go ahead and update that. And look at our invoice entry. Now, I mentioned that our requisition entry, purchase order entry, receipt entry, all very similar, and I also gave you the heads up that invoice entry would be different. So here it is, different look, and we'll go through it. Okay, so just like invoice entry in accounts payable, we start off with this little modal screen for our accounting date. We'll just accept the default here. Okay, so at this point it's good to remember that purchase orders layers on top of accounts payable, and what we're doing here is creating a more robust entry of information that will, let me grab this right up here, that will eventually filter into our AP invoice entry. Now, you might have to cast your mind back to that because that was several hours of training ago. So, as I noted, this modal dialog came up in our purchase order invoice entry, as it does here in AP. I'll just OK that, and let's just compare. You'll see how similar they are. So the information that we're putting here is predominantly the same information that we would put in at the AP invoice entry task. So that being said, now we're oriented so that we feel more familiar with what we're looking at. And let's go ahead and invoice this. Oops. I mistyped. Fair enough. And the system is right there to help me out with any kind of miskey. So it's asking, it says it didn't find that vendor. Do I want to create the record? And you should know that this is available to me to create the record because I have permissions to do so. You'd want to set the user role security appropriately. So in this case, no, I miskeyed. So let's try that again. And then we would have an invoice number. This is freeform, case sensitive, just like in AP. And we have the defaults, which we're used to seeing. Hold for manual release, again, just like in AP. Our dates behave the same way. Let's just type that in. PO, invoice, ref, just so you can see those fields later. And we'll put in the invoice amount. And then let's press F7 and hop into our grid. Now the grid is different because we're talking about purchase orders and receivers. So we are entering different information here, more detailed information, so that in the purchase order module we can track our receiver information. This is all item-based information, and let's just take a look at that. Now we have a lookup available to us here. If we don't remember the purchase order, if it's not, maybe it's smudged on the invoice we're working on. And we'll go ahead and grab this one. And it defaults the receiver here. Now, we could have multiple receivers for each purchase order, which makes sense because we could do the partial. Remember, if we didn't check the complete, that means that we have a back order. So we would have multiple receivers against a purchase order. In this case, we'll just go with that one. I'll press escape here. And let's save it. Now with the save, I don't know if you noticed, but right over here we now have a button available to us, our invoice detail. Let's click that and see what we have under here. Purchase order, the line, the receiver number, the standard items. Now all these are grayed out, meaning that they're disabled. This is the quantity received on that receiver with the cost. So here we can change costs if we want to. Now let's just go ahead and do that. And we can also enter in O-type lines, priced memos. So some additional charge of $50 and escape, save it, and we're done. So we can edit existing lines, we can enter in additional charges so that we get those recorded. If we had multiple lines here, we could also delete some of them. So a receiver can be for a purchase order with multiple lines, but you don't have to have all of the lines on a receiver, and this is where you go to edit it. So now we have an extended cost of $400, and we started off with an extended cost of $300, but we added additional costs. So let's close that, and now coming back here, you'll see that we have an additional line that's added with our $50, and also now our remaining is minus $100. So we said our invoice was for $300. That may have been a miskey, that may have been purposeful, but long story short, we have to correct this so that it will be 0. When we come into the header, we'll now see that the invoice detail button is grayed out and we have the GL distribution button available to us. So let's look at that one. And this looks just like any GL distribution that we've seen so far. As a matter of fact, casting your mind back to accounts payable, you would have seen the exact same thing, except for naturally this is in a window, whereas in the AP invoice entry, it was actually the detail grid. So you would just enter in an account that made sense with whatever adjusting entries were appropriate to bring the remaining to 0. So we have our purchase order invoice entered, and let's pop back into our purchase order invoice register. We can select the sequence that we want to print it by, summary by invoice or detail by purchase order. Let's grab the detail by purchase order. I'll let you look at the various types of ways you can print this. But with this type, what we see here is our header information. Remember, I put in those memos so that we could see those. And then for each purchase order, we have our receiver information. So this would be like the detail grid printing out for us. And then beneath that, our general ledger distribution. Pardon me, I misspoke. What I was trying to say was that this section would be like our invoice entry button section. That little window with the grid on it there. Okay, sorry for the confusion. And we have a purchase price variance report that prints along with this. And it's taking the information of what it was originally said to be for our PO cost, what it actually ended up to be. As we noted, we increased this. We have a quantity of 2. We increased this by $25, so that's an additional $50. That's our variance there. And it also lists our other type lines, our additional charge there for our invoice total. And finally, we have our GL summary for our purchase journal. So when we update this, we should track it back over here to AP. So payment selection entry in accounts payable. Let's go ahead and refresh our memories about our filters. You can readily see that we have created an open invoice for our $300 amount and it's ready for payment. So we've followed through in purchase orders, we followed through requisitions, generated purchase orders from the requisitions, chose not to in some cases, fair enough, left those on hold, followed one through into receiving, invoice entry, and updating, which took it all the way over into accounts payable and made it available for payment. We'll be circling back around and doing some more work with our purchase order entry, but for now let us go ahead and take a look at reports. I'll start with this open purchase order requisitions. Again, a number of ways to sort it, vendor, alpha, requisition, and depending on what we select there, we have the ability to enter in ranges for filters in these various fields here. The dates that'll be used as filters. The possible dates are date ordered, promised, required, and don't deliver before dates. So the 4 dates that are carried on the purchase orders and purchase requisitions themselves. And of course we can filter by the warehouse. Now this is a fairly common set of filters, an option entry form that's very common to our reports. Let's just go ahead and run it for all for our open purchase requisitions. So in this report we can see the 2 vendor requisitions that we're familiar with because we held them when we were working in our requisitions. And so this report shows the line item detail, the header information for any requisitions in our purchase requisition entry file. It includes the source information. These came from work orders, and we'll be looking at that in the manufacturing section. And pretty straightforward there. Another requisition report, requisition by item. Because it's by item, it starts with filtering for our warehouse and item ranges, as well as the requisitions, vendors, and again the dates. With a large amount of data, of course, those dates would be pretty important to have the ability to filter on. And you can see here that we have our items. Now, you might be wondering why there appears to be less data than there was on the open requisition report. This is for items. A lot of what was on our requisition report was non-stock. All of those line items that came in from our work order, so that whole first one was non-stock. And if we go ahead and pull up our document inquiry, I always put it under favorites myself, and grab the PDF for the open PO requisitions. Now that comes up in my browser, so I'll drag that over here so we can see it. And you can see what I'm saying about all of these being non-stock. Let me make that a little bigger, sorry. So from our work orders, the non-stock items, that's what the N is. These are our line codes. So these are S line codes, which in this case are also our line types. And here you can see that we have 5, 600, 1200, 500, 600, 1200. So that's how the 2 reports work together. One is all of the open requisitions, and with the header information, including the vendor and so forth, whereas the requisitions by item are showing the actual stock item information specifically. Let's go ahead and save that in case we need to refer back to it. Again, always a good practice. Let's take a look at our open purchase orders. By now this looks pretty familiar to you, depending on what we select here, vendor, alpha, purchase order. We get to enter data in one of those 3 sets of fields, date ordered, warehouse item at the bottom. Very standard. Now as you can see, this is a very dense report. A lot of information. It's essentially your purchase orders with everything listed for the purchase orders. So here's the one we're familiar with. I just popped to the second page there. Vendor VT 100 with our purchase order and our vendor name, the date ordered, the terms, our purchase address, our dates would be listed here, unit of measure conversion factor, and so forth. All that information just available right here with our items that, as you can see here on the one above it, multiple items are listed with the various line codes and so forth. So you can see how with different line codes we have different handling for the formatting of our lines. And if you were to look at the purchase orders themselves, they would look like this in a form format. So very direct correlation there. And purchase orders by item. Again, we have a theme here with the by item, starting with the lead filters or the warehouse item, and followed by the purchase order and so forth. Let's go ahead and run it for all. And as promised, or by the name, it's sorted by item, and it gives the information for the purchase orders, vendor, unit of measure, date required, promised, not before, plus all the quantity information for the individual purchase order line item. If there were multiple, again this is demo data so there's not a lot of lines available, multiple lines would be listed here if there were multiple purchase orders having a certain line item on it or an inventory item on it. And it gives you the nice synopsis of the information of the quantity on order for each of our items. Okay, let's take a look at the expediting report. Now we can select a range of purchase orders and vendors and specify a specific warehouse. It's this expedite through date that's of particular interest. If, due to the nature of the data that we have in our system right now, the bulk of it, as we recall, our demo data, the bulk of it is in March. If I were to put in April 11th date, I would actually be saying give me pretty much everything. So let us back up here and put in 3.1. I'm sorry, 3.1. There we go. And F5 to run the report. And that expedite through date is compared against the date required for each line item for all the purchase orders that are within the filters that you specify as well. We said all of them, so it checked all of our open purchase orders for the line item, row by row, for the date required as of that date or prior. So this is saying that we should be receiving, let's look at this bottom one here, we ordered 10, we've already received 8 and 9 depending on the row here, and we still have 2 left on our B200, and we have 1 that we're expecting for our B100, and we're expecting those by 3.1. And what you should know about this is that if even one of our rows, one of our line items, has a date required as of the expedite through date, the whole purchase order will be shown. So it's not just showing individual lines with the date required as of the expedite through date. It shows the full purchase order. Let's look at our PO status report. So this has our basic filters, purchase order, vendor, alternate sequence based on what we select there, and our warehouse. Very similar to our open purchase order report, but the status report includes contact information and terms and whatnot, more along the lines of actually contacting people rather than just looking at the details of a purchase order itself. Gives you the information that you might need when you talk with your contacts. And then our cash requirements report here. The purchase order cash requirements report, similar to the accounts payable cash requirements report in that it's talking about cash requirements, but it's specific to our purchase orders. So I'll just run it for the defaults and we'll see that the data that we have here is by vendor purchase order, and it gives us the information about what items we're talking about. Here's our favorite item and vendor, and then it gives us the total and it ages it. So a little bit different, well actually largely different. It's focused on our purchase orders, and because I did run it in detail, it's giving us the information by line item. And now our billed unbilled report has a lot of the usual suspects in these first ones, and then we have our option here for all billed or unbilled. So let's just run it for all for now. Okay, this report notes at the top that we ran it for billed and unbilled, and you can also visually see that here we have invoice data. These are billed, and that includes the AP type and so forth. Now on our left we have the receipt amount, and on our right we have the receipt amount on the invoice, and then we have a variance here. So this column, the invoice total column, you'll notice that the data may repeat. That's because we may have multiple purchase orders, as we can see across here, purchase order number. So we have multiple purchase orders on an invoice, and then the purchase orders are broken down, but the invoice total is repeated so that you can just look across and know how much each particular purchase order had a total, and still see the invoice total. Now down here you can see that these don't have any invoices associated with them. These are the unbilled, and if we ran the report for unbilled only, it would list just, in the case of vendor 100 here, just these four. So a lot of good data here as far as that goes. Our billed unbilled report. Now let's look at our receipt variance. This report is an analysis of promise date, receipt date, so a date analysis. We can, as you can see, we can filter it in various ways, and we can also specify a minimum variance to show on the report. So here we can see that we have our date received versus our date required and date promised. In this case, we actually got it on 12/5, but we needed it on the second, so that's a variance of -3. So a little analysis report here for telling how well our vendors are doing for us. By purchase order also, so a little historical look with our totals by vendors. Vendor 100 is not doing very well for us, really. Okay, so receipt variance was talking about the days, whereas our cost variance is variance in cost. Similar form here, but let's look at the... Okay, so as we can see here, we're looking at receipt value versus order value, getting a variance, and it also includes a variance ratio broken down by purchase order. And then receipt history by vendor. Again, includes the usual suspects for our filtering. We'll just run it for... And let's just hop right to the end to see our very favorite vendor down here with the purchase order and receipt that we are familiar with. So you can see it includes a lot of the information that you would see on your open purchase orders, but it also includes the receiver information, including our totals by receiver and purchase order and vendor. Okay, we can look at the same information by item. And as we saw earlier, the difference between the by items, by item report, and the by vendor type report. It lists it by item, followed by vendor within that item, gives us our purchase order and various other columns of data. So you can see our very favorite vendor and purchase order, but listed with different sorts of data. Oops, here we go. Alright, so that's our reports and purchase orders. Now we will be circling back around and looking at purchase orders again, at least 2 other times. One will be after we've looked at our order processing, so sales orders, and we'll come back to purchase orders after we enter in some sales orders, and in purchase orders we'll look at drop ships. And we will also come back to purchase orders in our manufacturing sections, where we will look at the links between our purchase orders and our work orders. But wait, you may think to yourself, we haven't discussed closing purchase orders. We haven't done a period end processing on purchase orders. Well, we've trained you well if you're thinking that you're looking for that, but there is no separate close process for purchase orders. Whatever reports here might be meaningful to a business, they should run them. But there's no formal close process, there's no period end update for purchase orders. So we are in fact done with purchase orders for now. So in our purchase order session, we started with some nitty-gritty details about replenishment processing. The slides we studied in the demo discussion, along with the supporting documentation, very important that, are all different ways to approach replenishment, all tools in your arsenal should you be the one buttonholed answering a support question on it. We also looked at the flow of the purchase order module. We noted that requisition entry, purchase order entry, receipt entry are all very similar for ease of use as the data flows from one to the next. And we touched on the purchase order invoice entry with its two supporting grids, one for the general ledger distribution, which you access from the invoice header, the other for invoice line item adjustments. That grid's accessed from the detail section of the main form. And finally, we wrap things up with a tour of the reports available in the purchase order module. As I said, we'll be coming back to purchase orders in future sessions, but for now, let's take your questions on purchase orders.